The afternoon sun was lazily sinking down Valencia Boulevard in Santa Clarita, painting a golden amber on the weathered facades of the auto repair shops that stood like anachronistic sentinels in an urban landscape increasingly dominated by sterile dealerships and corporate auto centers. Among these relics of a more artisanal era, Ramirez Auto Repair stood out not for the modernity of its equipment or the shine of its peeling paint, but for the almost mystical aura of competence that emanated from its open doors, where decades of mechanical wisdom had crystallized into a kind of centuries-old cathedral dedicated to the resurrection of dying engines. Hector Ramirez, at 73, carried in his calloused, oil-stained hands a living history of the evolution of the American automotive industry. From the roaring muscle cars of the Golden Age to the complex electronic systems that now governed even the simplest vehicles, his back, bent from 5 decades of hunching over open hoods, told a silent tale of dedication to a craft that had become simultaneously a lost art and a fundamental necessity in a society that depended entirely on running engines but had almost completely lost the ability to understand how those engines actually operated. Hector's shop wasn't just a business, it was a sanctuary for wounded machines, a hospital for vehicles that others had abandoned as hopeless cases. The time-blackened walls were lined with tools that looked like archaeological relics, each one polished from constant use and carrying stories of thousands of repairs that had brought life back to dead metal. The oil-stained concrete floor was like a topographical map of decades of work, each stain documenting a battle won against the mechanical entropy that constantly threatened to reduce every vehicle to useless scrap. It was an ordinary Thursday when the metallic blue Nissan Skyline GTR purred through the garage door like a wounded feline seeking refuge. The car was a work of automotive art, aggressive lines that communicated speed even when stopped, an engine that whispered promises of power few mortals would ever fully experience. But even mechanical masterpieces were not immune to the inevitabilities of physics. Something in the drivetrain was making a noise that suggested serious problems, if not addressed quickly. The driver who emerged from the skyline defied every social categorization Hector had learned to make over decades of serving the diverse clientele of the Santa Clarita Valley. Dressed in faded jeans that looked like they had survived countless off-road adventures, and a simple t-shirt that revealed the tanned arms of someone who had spent considerable time in the California sun, the man moved with the spare grace of someone who was genuinely comfortable in his own skin. His blonde hair was tousled by the wind, not the calculated messiness of the wealthy kids of Beverly Hills, but the authentic mark of someone who had driven with the windows down through the mountains of the Angeles National Forest. "Afternoon," the man said, approaching with a smile that carried the democratic informality that defined the best American tradition. No hierarchy, no pretense, just one person addressing another with basic respect. "You must be Hector. I hear you're the go-to guy for transmission problems." Hector wiped his hands on a rag that had absorbed so much oil over the years that it had become a permanent extension of his professional persona. In the complex social economy of Los Angeles County, where status was often measured by zip codes and property values, Hector's shop functioned as a democratic neutral zone where the only currency that mattered was technical competence. He had served corrupt politicians driving armored Mercedes, reality TV stars in rented Lamborghinis, and construction workers in Ford pickups with 500,000 miles on them. What he had learned was that cars said more about people than clothes, addresses, or credit cards. "Depends on what you've got," Hector replied, gesturing at the skyline with the professional pride of someone who still got a thrill from encountering truly special machines. "That's a real GTR, not one of the conversion kits I see around here." The young man's eyes lit up with the recognition that only genuine enthusiasts share when they meet someone who understands the difference between automotive appearance and substance. "Exactly. R34, direct import. The guy who sold it to me said you were one of the few mechanics in the area who really understood 1990s Nissan systems." It was a compliment that struck a chord deep within Hector's professional soul. In an increasingly disposable American culture where cars were often treated like electronics that needed to be replaced every 2 years, finding someone who valued automotive craftsmanship was like finding water in the desert. The fact that this young man had specifically sought out his expertise, rather than simply taking his car to the nearest Nissan dealership, suggested an understanding of the difference between corporate service and craftsmanship. "What's the problem?" Hector asked, already walking toward the car with the anticipation of a surgeon about to diagnose an interesting patient. "There's a noise in the transmission when I shift into third," the man explained, following Hector around the vehicle. "It's not constant, but it definitely wasn't like this when I bought it, and honestly, this car means too much to me to risk it on someone who doesn't know what they're doing." Hector nodded, understanding immediately. In American automotive mythology, certain cars transcend mere functionality to become extensions of their owners' identities. The Skyline GTR held a special place in that pantheon, an icon of Japanese engineering that had earned respect on American streets through sheer performance, not marketing or social status. Owning a genuine example was a statement of values, a preference for substance over flash, for real capability over public perception. "Let me take a look," Hector said, opening the hood with the reverence he reserved for truly special machines. The RB26 DET engine revealed itself in all its industrial complexity, a straight six that had been designed not to impress in showrooms but to dominate on racetracks. Every component communicated a singular purpose: to extract maximum power from every drop of fuel while maintaining reliability that allowed for everyday use. "Did you do the modifications yourself?" Hector asked, noting subtle but sophisticated upgrades that only serious enthusiasts would undertake. "Most of it," the young man replied with the modest pride of someone who had invested time learning about the machines he loved. "Intake, exhaust, a few ECU tweaks, nothing too extreme. I want it to be reliable for everyday driving." It was exactly the answer Hector had expected from someone who really understood cars. In American automotive modification culture, there was a fundamental divide between genuine enthusiasts who improved performance through carefully considered changes and show-offs who installed visual modifications designed purely to attract attention. This young man clearly belonged to the former group, each modification serving a specific functional purpose. "It'll take me a few hours to diagnose it properly," Hector said, already mentally cataloging the necessary procedures. "The GTR's transmission is complex. It's not something you want to rush." "How long do you need?" the young man asked, but his tone suggested he was more concerned with quality than speed. "I'll finish by the end of the week, Friday afternoon." "Perfect." The young man extended his hand. "By the way, I'm Paul." "Hector," the mechanic replied, shaking the offered hand. There was something in the firmness of the grip, not performative or exaggerated but solidly confident, that confirmed Hector's initial impression of the car owner's character. Paul left the Skyline on Thursday and disappeared into the labyrinthine complexities of Los Angeles County, where millions of people navigate daily between work, family, and the hundreds of micro-communities that make up the largest experiment in cultural and economic diversity in American history. For Hector, the GTR represented more than a job. It was an opportunity to exercise decades of accumulated knowledge in one of the purest examples of automotive engineering ever created. Over the next 3 days, Hector dissected the drivetrain with the patience of an archaeologist, uncovering precious artifacts. The problem, when finally identified, turned out to be relatively minor: a worn synchronizer that was causing resistance during specific shifts. It was the kind of repair that dealerships often used as justification for unnecessary replacements of entire components, turning a repair costing a few $100s into a bill for thousands. But for Hector, finding and fixing the specific problem without disrupting other systems was a matter of professional pride. He spent hours locating the exact part needed through his network of specialized suppliers, men like himself who had devoted entire careers to keeping alive vehicles that manufacturers had deemed obsolete. It was an invisible but vital subculture of the American economy, craftsmen who preserved the country's mechanical heritage through knowledge that no university taught and no corporation could replicate. By Friday afternoon, when Paul returned to pick up the Skyline, Hector had not only fixed the original problem, but performed a thorough inspection that revealed minor adjustments that would optimize overall performance. It was the kind of additional service he offered only to cars and owners he respected, an investment of extra time that never showed up on the bill, but that represented the difference between professional competence and artistic mastery. "How's my baby?" Paul asked, leaning in with the affectionate eagerness of a worried father. "Transmission is perfect now," Hector replied, not quite able to hide the pride in his voice. "It was the third-gear synchro. I replaced it with an OEM part that'll outlast the rest of the car, and I tweaked a few other little things I found." Paul started the engine and heard the RB26 purr with the perfect harmony that only properly tuned engines produce. It was automotive music, each cylinder contributing its individual note to a mechanical symphony that spoke of restrained power, Japanese precision, and decades of technical evolution. "How much do I owe?" Paul asked, reaching for his wallet. Hector had calculated the cost based on his usual rates, labor time, part price, plus the modest margin that kept his shop afloat in an economy where commercial rents in the Santa Clarita Valley had tripled in the past decade. $350. It was a price that reflected genuine value, significantly less than any dealership would charge, but fair for the quality of work provided. Paul didn't hesitate, counting out the bills with the quickness of someone accustomed to recognizing and paying for real competence when he found it. "Hector," Paul said, handing over the money, "thank you for treating my car like it was your own. It's rare to find someone who actually cares." "Cars like this deserve respect," Hector replied with the simplicity that characterized men of his generation who had learned to express emotion through action rather than words. Paul drove away that Friday afternoon, the Skyline responding to his commands with the mechanical precision that only properly executed repairs can restore. For Hector, it was just another job well done in a career built on 5 decades of jobs well done. He had no way of knowing that he was about to discover that the respectful young man who had entrusted his precious car to his care carried an identity that would completely redefine his understanding of fame, humility, and the unseen, complexities that define human character. A week later, on a Wednesday that started out like any other in Hector's meticulous routine, the universe conspired to reveal that not all stories end when we think they do. The mechanic was working under the hood of a Chevy Suburban that had seen better days when he heard the familiar sound of a well-tuned engine approaching. He immediately recognized the distinctive purr of the RB26. He'd spent enough time with that particular engine to pick out its sonic signature among hundreds of others. But as he straightened up, dusting his hands off and preparing to greet Paul, who was presumably returning for some additional tuning or perhaps to recommend his shop to another enthusiast, Hector saw something that left him completely confused. Paul was indeed driving the Skyline, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, a procession of vehicles was forming, expensive cars, SUVs with tinted windows, and what appeared to be a film crew complete with professional cameras and sound equipment. "What the hell?" Hector muttered to himself, watching. The small caravan positioned itself around his modest workshop as if it were the set of some major Hollywood production. Paul emerged from the Skyline with the same genuine smile he'd displayed during their previous interactions, but now he carried a different energy, a confidence that suggested he was about to reveal something significant. Behind him, figures Hector vaguely recognized began to emerge from the other vehicles. There were men in expensive suits carrying clipboards, women in headsets coordinating unseen activities, and cameras being positioned with the military precision that characterizes professional productions. "Hector," Paul called, walking toward the confused mechanic with open arms as if greeting an old friend. "How are you?" "Well," Hector replied hesitantly, his eyes moving between Paul and the growing circus of activity around his workshop. "Paul, what's going on here?" Paul stopped in front of the mechanic, and for a moment his expression turned serious, filled with an emotion that Hector couldn't quite interpret. "Hector, can I ask you a personal question?" The mechanic nodded, still completely lost about the situation that was developing around him. "Do you have children?" The question caught Hector off guard. "I do. 3 children, all grown up now. Why?" "And grandchildren?" "4 grandchildren," Hector replied, a note of pride entering his voice despite his growing confusion. Paul smiled, and there was something in that smile that communicated that they were getting to the heart of some important revelation. "Do they know what you do for a living?" "Of course you do. I've been a mechanic for 50 years. "And they respect that? The work you do?" Hector considered the question. It was true that some of his grandchildren sometimes looked embarrassed when friends asked about their grandfather's profession. In contemporary American culture, where success was often measured by college degrees and office jobs, manual labor, professions had lost much of the prestige they once held. "Some respect more than others," Hector admitted honestly. Paul nodded as if he had expected exactly that answer. "Hector, do you know who I am?" The question forced the mechanic to really look at Paul for the first time since he'd arrived. There was something familiar about him, a quality Hector couldn't quite place, as if he'd seen that face before but couldn't remember where. "You look familiar," Hector said slowly, "but I can't." "My name is Paul Walker," Paul said gently, carefully watching the mechanic's reaction. The name echoed in Hector's mind for a moment before the realization hit with devastating force. Paul Walker, the actor, Fast and Furious. The man whose face had appeared on movie posters all over Los Angeles County, whose movies his grandchildren had watched over and over again, whose tragic death a few years from now would shock millions of fans around the world. "You are," Hector began, but the words trailed off as he tried to process the magnitude of what was being revealed. "I'm an actor," Paul confirmed, "and I'm genuinely passionate about cars. Everything I told you about the skyline, about respecting it, about wanting someone who really understands it, all of that was completely true." Hector looked around the workshop, seeing it through different eyes now. The cameras, the crew, the elaborate production. It was all beginning to make sense, in a way that left him simultaneously honored and overwhelmed. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Hector asked, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and confusion. Paul smiled, and in that smile Hector saw the same genuineness he had noticed during their first interaction. "Because I wanted you to know me as Paul first, before you knew me as Paul Walker the actor. I wanted our interaction to be based on mutual respect for cars and craftsmanship, not status or fame." The explanation touched something deep in Hector's heart. How many times in his life had he been treated as an employee rather than a craftsman, as a service provider rather than an expert? Paul had deliberately chosen to approach him as an equal, acknowledging and honoring his expertise before revealing his own identity. "But why go back now, with all this?" Hector gestured to the cameras and crew. "Because," Paul said, his voice gaining an emotional intensity that made all the activity around them seem secondary, "I want the world to know about men like you. Masters of your craft who keep our automotive culture alive through knowledge that can't be taught in schools or replicated by computers." Paul paused, looking directly into Hector's eyes. "And because I want your grandchildren to see their grandfather honored for what he truly is. Not just a mechanic, but an artist, a preserver of traditions, a man whose hands can bring life back to dead metal." The words struck Hector with an emotional force he hadn't expected. For decades he had found meaning and purpose in his work, but he had rarely considered that it could be seen as anything more than an honest way to earn a living. "Hector," Paul continued, "would you like to appear in one of my films? As yourself? The mechanic who really understands cars, who can work miracles with tools and knowledge?" The question left Hector speechless. The possibility that his expertise might be presented to a national audience, that his grandchildren might see their grandfather on the big screen doing the work he loved, was something that transcended any fantasy he had ever entertained. I don't know what to say," Hector admitted. "Say yes," Paul encouraged. Because the world needs to see that real heroism isn't just in car chases and explosions, it's in men like you who dedicate their lives to mastering a craft, who treat every machine as if it were precious, who pass on their knowledge to the next generation. Hector looked around his workshop, the stained walls, the worn tools, the floor that told the story of 5 decades of honest labor. For a moment, he tried to see it through Paul Walker's eyes, through the cameras that were being positioned, to capture this sacred space where dead metal was resurrected daily. "Will my grandchildren be able to see this?" Hector asked. "Your grandchildren," Paul said with a smile that lit up his entire face, "will be able to see their grandfather, presented to the world as the master craftsman he always was." And in that moment, in the small workshop in the Santa Clarita Valley where American automotive traditions were preserved by a man who had dedicated his life to understanding the soul of machines, 2 stories merged into a narrative about respect, recognition, and the transformative power of seeing value where others see only craftsmanship. Hector Ramirez said yes, and 3 months later, when the film was released and his grandchildren watched their grandfather on the big screen, demonstrating the mastery that had been his trademark for 5 decades, they finally understood that they had grown up in the presence of a living legend, a man whose hands could bring life back to dead metal, and whose knowledge represented a direct connection to the traditions that built America on wheels. Paul Walker had given Hector more than recognition. He had given cultural legitimacy to a vanishing way of life, transforming a neighborhood mechanic into a national symbol of an artisanal expertise that defined the best of the American tradition, of skilled workmanship. And Hector had given Paul something equally valuable, the reminder that authentic connection transcends social status, that real mastery is recognized instinctively by those who possess it, and that sometimes the most meaningful encounters happen when we remove all masks and approach each other simply as human beings sharing common passions.